Hello and welcome back to Right Now. I'm Stephen Kent. When we launched this show back in February, I spoke at length about the intellectual shakeup happening on the right and how it was the mission of this show to highlight the players in that story. Zombie Reaganism, the school of Milton Friedman economics, the neoconservative foreign policy establishment, and even the libertarian talent pipeline in Washington, D.C. All of these things are being challenged today on the political right. Donald Trump represents a lot of things, and one of them is undoubtedly a challenge to the elite class in Washington, who no matter how many times they objectively fail, or lead us into disastrous wars, or hold up low-cost furniture at Walmart as the highest possible good for Americans, will continue to scold all of you out there for being bad people if you distrust them. When you say this, lightweight Twitter warriors are going to inevitably hurl a photo of Donald Trump surrounded by gold furniture and supermodels at you and go, "This guy is your champion against the elites?" It's an uninteresting response. Even in ancient Rome, you had the populares, the political faction who, yes, lived in decadence, but who ordered their politics around the people, versus the optimates who believed government was best left to the enlightened few and ordered around keeping the masses in check. They're both elites and both completely self-interested, but wholly divided on how they think government should relate to the people's discontent. Are you angry that Main Street shops are closing every single day while Amazon offers a free shipping on consumer products that they conveniently own? Are you angry that cities are building more apartments and single-bedroom dwellings than they are single-family homes? Are you bothered that Bank of America sifted through the accounts of their customers for activity related to Washington, D.C. around January 6th and then shared that data with the FBI without even being asked? If I had to describe the standard Beltway libertarian reaction to these things, it's indifference. There's nothing to be done here, is what they typically say. It's a bit hyperbolic, but it is true that libertarians in the establishment conservative world, they shrink away from using the government for their ends. We're going to talk about all of this and get into it, but first, a quick request for you to hit that subscribe button on our show here on YouTube. You can also follow us on any podcatcher out there and do subscribe, and follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook at RightlyAJ. My guest today thinks the American right has been asleep at the wheel and abandoned their responsibility to govern, and govern well. Saurabh Sharma is the president of American Moment and the host of the Moment of Truth podcast. Saurabh, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
It is really nice to have you here. I have called you a couple of times now, sort of like the, what would be the Zoomer diplomat for traditional conservatism.
I speak for the Zoomers, like the Lorax speaks for the trees.
Your name comes up a lot in those circles, and I think it's important to have you on the show to really get a sense of who you are and what American Moment is. But first, let's start with you. Could you tell me a little bit about your background, where you come from, how you ended up here in the swamp?
Sure. Well, against my will is basically the answer. I interned here a couple of years ago and swore to myself, like on bended knee, that I would never, ever, ever come back. And eventually that softened to, okay, only if I'm married with kids will I ever come back. Eventually that softened to, okay, well,
I'll date, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's just like, and then it was like, okay, out of sheer love of country and mission, I guess I have to come up here and I'm going to do my best to insulate myself from all of the, the issues with the swamp. But before that, I was very involved in Texas politics. I was leading an organization called Young Conservatives of Texas out there. Lived in Texas for 7 years, came to love it. I'm wearing my cowboy boots right now and try to get back as soon as I can, every month or so. But my parents still live out there. And then before that, kind of lived all over the place. I lived in India for 3 years for my 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. Before that, in Atlanta, LA, Seattle, Lexington,
Your family
Albuquerque.
from India?
They are. I was born in India, and when I was 3 months old, we moved to the United States.
Okay.
Yeah. So have hopped around all over the place, seen a lot of America, seen a lot of other countries as well, and love the country.
One thing I'm curious about with you is that in my experience, I was in college Republicans. I was a Republican, unregistered in high school as well. It's kind of a conveyor belt. It's kind of like they're all made in a factory and they all are made to believe kind of the same things. It's the zombie Reaganism thing, right? Like, It's like, this is the ultimate example of conservatism. It cannot be anything else. And I have noticed that starting to decline. Trump is obviously sort of one of the big flashes in the pan for that. But Gen Zers, as far as I can tell, coming to Washington, are not really interested in those kind of ideas and think differently. You are somewhat of a nationalist. I'm curious how you got there. Where did you sort of like get off of the conveyor belt and go in a different direction?
Yeah, I think I always had sort of interesting perspectives on a lot of these issues. I had priors that would have led me to believe different things than what the mainstream conservative movement has traditionally advocated for. I was always an immigration restrictionist. I always had interesting perspectives on it. Being an immigrant myself, but not in the porous borders direction, actually in the more restrictive direction, because I've lived in communities where immigration has been done well and where it's been done poorly. And so I sort of had none of these sort of white guilt that I think permeates a lot of people when they're talking about immigration. So I didn't have that prior holding me back. And then I would look at the issue dispassionately. It was something that I thought was essential to good community formation, was getting immigration policy right. So that immediately put me at odds with the broader conservative movement. I didn't necessarily have deeply orthodox conceptions of like, this is the only way to be conservative on economics. You must be an arch libertarian. Otherwise you are not in good standing. So didn't have that holding me back as a shackle. Was always very insistent on sort of tough on crime policies. Having lived in India for my idealistic early teenage years, seeing crime, seeing corruption, it was deeply radicalizing. I always had a fairly robust sense of justice.
So some of your political instincts come from those teenage years being back home in India. India's experienced its own sort of nationalist movement of sorts. Immigration crime is a big issue there. Mm-hmm. And so you formed those opinions really there and kind of solidified them and brought them here.
Yeah, I think a combination of them. You know, I sort of, there's an old line in the social science, which is that you don't really know one country unless you know two. And so I came to appreciate everything we have in the United States so much more, having seen where things can go awry, you know, specifically on things like crime. And it makes me just a lot less tolerant of, say, when our cities burned last year. And I see civilization as a eggshell thin coat of paint that if you chip away at it, you can't get it back easily. And so it just gave me priors for being much more on the order side of the spectrum of order and liberty that the conservative movement is always jostling at different equilibrium points on. And it sort of led to me being very activated around the time of the 2016 election to support the more sort of populist and nationalist agenda that President Trump ran and won on in those years.
You don't like to use the populist word, right?
No, I'm not the biggest fan of it.
Why?
Because I think that there are, it comes down to what I think the responsibility of leaders should be. The responsibility of leaders should be to be good, to be patriotic, to be sort of noble elites that look for the best for the people. And that sometimes it's popular, sometimes it's not, right? I mean, is it populist circa 2015 for President Trump to run on a trade protection platform when the broad populace of the Republican Party does not yet support that, right? Leadership is built in to governing and leading people on policy issues that matter, that are in their best interests, is part and parcel of that. You don't get from 80% supporting free trade in the Republican Party to 80% not supporting free trade in the Republican Party on populism alone. You get it on advocating for an agenda that is in their interest, in the national interest.
I think that's part of the area where I get a little confused with sort of your faction's view of responsibility to the people, that there is a duty of the elite, the people here in Washington, to do what is best for the people, but also not always just follow public opinion right off the cliff, right? Like if the people don't know what is in their best interest, or if the people believe that steel tariffs will actually be good for them, but it ends up resulting in 75 to 175,000 jobs being lost and more steel mills being closed, I would think that it is then in the responsibility of the populist or the nationalist to actually be like, I know you think foreign imports are the problem here, but we are not going to levy tariffs. Do you kind of get where I'm coming from on that?
I think that's entirely fair if it's in evidence, but it's not necessarily, right? And I think that, there's sort of a tripartite set of issues that I think distinguished President Trump when he first ran in 2015 from the rest of the field. Foreign policy, ending endless wars, immigration, and trade. And maybe more broadly considered economic nationalism, right? Each of those issues had a consensus opinion in sort of liberal internationalist circles that was at varying degrees proven wrong. The idea that that you would see low-end wage increases for the first time in a half century because of the policies of a restrictive trade regime, of a restrictive immigration regime, would have been contra everything that was coming out of elite circles in DC. It's always a balancing act, right? That's why it can't be the rule that whatever is popular is good and whatever is good is popular. But I think it does involve looking beyond the very narrow consensus on what is even a political question to begin with that exists in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, kind of one of those intersections, or I guess crossroads, where public opinion, maybe what is good for people, and then what is right, doesn't make much sense. As I mentioned earlier in the introduction of the episode, like the price of furniture at Walmart. Kind of the libertarian orthodoxy is to talk about trade and products coming from China and go, now more people can have the nice homes that they always envisioned. More people can get access to the consumer goods that they might not otherwise be able to afford. I myself, very low income in my mid and early 20s, was able to have an apartment that made me proud because the goods were cheap. And libertarians, I think, skew towards saying, well, that is good. So we should protect that. And I feel like the other side of this argument has gone off to, well, maybe you should just buy more expensive furniture or not have it at all and buy American.
Right. I mean, it's a thought experiment. Is it better that your $350 TV is $325 or that 1,000 factory workers in Michigan are able to, provide for their family and live a decent life doing blue collar work in an economy where at least some people need to do blue collar work because not everyone wants to sit and do a knowledge job. That is not strictly speaking popular because a million people may have to spend, $25 extra on a TV, but it does ensure that we have a dignified economy for the broad middle of the country that doesn't leave people behind and force them into a constant cycle of sort of deracination, joblessness, instability that prevents family formation and that prevents their long-term thriving.
What are the first things, the core principles that you aim to further with your new project, American Moment? What are the things that you view as under crisis that you are trying to save?
I think that a American conservative movement and any patriotic movement that seeks the betterment of this country seeks three things: strong families, a sovereign nation, and prosperity for all. Now, I'm kind of talking our shop here. That's in our mission statement. That's how we frame what our ends are. And it's very much framed in terms of ends. I think that there's a focus on abstract principles to our detriment a lot on the conservative side of the spectrum, when in reality, I think
what's kind of one of the abstract principles that you think just doesn't make any practical sense?
I think that, if you look at the traditional mission statement of organizations founded in, say, the 1980s, there's usually a couple of lines, right? It's limited government, fiscal responsibility, a strong national defense, and personal responsibility.
Sure.
So I think those are sometimes the four that are thrown around. Limited government. I support limited government. I don't want government to be larger than it needs to be. However, there is not contained within limited government any value assessment about what is good and bad. You can have a government that is strictly speaking the same size, that spends the same amount of money, but does radically different things in terms of providing for the common good. And so I think it's very important to ask deeper questions and to actually engage in public policy beyond less is more. Less is more is a good aphorism. It's good folk wisdom, but it doesn't apply to, governing a transcontinental empire, which is what the United States is.
Do you like to refer to America as an empire? Because I often, when I've listened to interviews of you, you use the word regime a lot. And that doesn't happen much in American politics. People in this town use the word administration, but you always refer to whoever is in charge as the regime. And that feels like it is part of your worldview.
I think so. I mean, I think that the nature of the state at this point in time, the nexus between corporate America, the private sector, cultural institutions in Hollywood and academia, and the formal organs of political power like the government under the Democratic Party coalescing into an entity that works in tandem, it's not sufficient to call that the state or the government. I think the regime is much more accurate. Time magazine did this incredible, how we did it profile about the election of 2020, where they talked about how political party elites in the Democratic Party, the leaders of tech companies, private sector organizations, all worked together, and they're putting a positive value assessment on it. I think that there's something interesting to be discussed there. But
how we did it.
Yeah, how we did it.
This was a team effort here.
Yeah. And that is not government. That is something beyond government. That is a regime, and that's I think a useful title to describe this sort of nexus that exists between all of these domains of power in American life working in tandem against the great middle of the country.
And you want to tinker with the power structure as it is, change the people who operate within it. American Moment is not a think tank necessarily. It's not developing white papers. It's developing people. My understanding of DC, I've been here since 2015. There is a fellowship and some sort of right-wing paid internship opportunity on every single corner of town. You just trip over them everywhere in Arlington. There's tons of opportunity, but there is a little bit of a gap that I think you have identified in terms of filling government jobs. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, and I think it's downstream of the ideological priors that the Republican Party and the conservative movement have had for the last 50 years. It's very hard to convince people who are motivated primarily by hatred of government to engage in long-term institution building with and around government.
We talked about that last week. I was with a couple of other fellow libertarians, and I just had to vent for a minute. I was like, what if this has all been a mistake since the Tea Party, that we've just spent, all of these years railing against government and getting people ginned up about it working well, and now it doesn't work well, and we're mad and surprised as if it doesn't serve some sort of good.
Right. I think that there's two axes that matter at all times, right? There's what does government do, and then does it do it well? And Democrats have an answer to both of those things. Liberals have an answer to both of those things. So far, Republicans and conservatives have only had an answer to one of those things. They say government should do less. The problem is that if that is the overwhelming ideological consensus within your political movement, it's going to be very hard to accrue and attract the sort of talent that is needed to actually govern in a sustainable and a competent way. And put aside all of the ideological disagreements that we have, I think the American people fundamentally deserve good governance, whoever's in power. And they don't get that in often cases when conservatives are in power. And there's a special gap when it comes to conservatives of my persuasion who have these more nationalist tendencies. There's almost no, the term state capacity is thrown around. There's no institutional capacity or state capacity to actually govern in that way because
it's a self-selection problem.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, with like college campus bias, right. And teachers in public schools. Just people naturally drift towards certain kinds of jobs. It's not like they aren't hiring conservatives. It's that like for so many years, conservatives didn't go into academia and now the gates are kind of closed. And then you have to find a way to remedy that problem. I think government and bureaucracy might be an example of where that persists.
Right. And here's the calculation that I like to put in front of people is that even if you decimated, literally in the traditional term of the word, 1/10 the administrative state, there are still thousands of political appointments and GS scale, federal bureaucracy appointments that every president needs to make. And the question is that are we going to essentially give up all of that as conservatives? Are we going to say, no, we're going to put our fingers in our ear, go la, 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 pretend these don't exist and don't really build the pipeline in order to fill these positions with people who have the best interests of the country in mind?
And that's kind of where American Moment was born, was out of your discontent with the people who filled the Trump administration, who you view it as being derailed by.
Right. I think that there was a basic dichotomy, which was that if you were competent, you were completely contra the president's interests and the interests of the voters that he represented. And if you were aligned, chances are you didn't have a lot of experience or competence in actually navigating the federal bureaucracy, and so your effectiveness was limited. That problem is not going away. It's going to continue to exist for every conservative president for the next 50 years. We have a choice. Are we going to solve it? Or are we going to essentially go to the American people and say, all we can offer you is a lesser of two evils, and you're going to have not necessarily well-managed government, but it's at least going to protect you from those Democrats? I think that's a raw deal.
The part of this that I guess I don't understand about responsibility for, say, the Trump years not going well, like as if it was some kind of failure because he didn't get reelected. We had Betsy DeVos in the Department of Education. She reined in Title IX. We were able to pass, I know you don't like tax cuts as like an ultimate good, but like Trump's agenda of tax cuts was passed, 2 Supreme Court justices. Things happened in the Trump years that were good for conservative aims. But you talk about Trump's administration as if it was only stifled and that he was the guy who was victimized by these people. Like, is he a wrecking ball, or does he just have no know-how of how to govern and how to build an administration? Because I don't think he can be both.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the house that Trump built, as it were, right? As someone who comes from my perspective on these issues, what I view as the more traditionally conservative ways of thinking about issues like trade, immigration, and so on, it's important to rewind back to the 2014, 2015, say post Romney, post-mortem era. There was no room for dissidents on any of these issues. If you questioned the Iraq War, you were laughed out of town. If you thought that our immigration regime, legal and illegal, was fundamentally irresponsible and damaging to American workers, you were considered a crank or a racist. If you thought that our trade regime was really bad for the country, you were considered, uncultured on economics. Trump came in and he created a wide open space through sheer force of will to actually change the consensus on these issues. But it is necessarily the same Trump that did not know all of the pieties and the structure and the details of how Washington works that could have had the wherewithal to be that disruptor in the first place. There is no version of someone who perfectly understands the Washington bureaucracy and how to use it that also had those views, because the entire apparatus had iced out people like that for 2 generations. And so I have a hard time blaming him. Instead, I'm grateful for the opportunity that's been created, and I want to make sure that we don't make this mistake again on the personnel side.
I don't mean to do a hard pivot here, but I guess I'm going to, because you mentioned an irresponsible immigration regime. Is your being here and your family being here part of a irresponsible immigration regime? Was that a mistake, a policy?
I think that, personalizing these things is always where, policy goes wrong. It's not that there is any particular person who should or should not be here. It's that an immigration policy for the United States should reflect the interests of existing American citizens. Now, I believe in a broad restriction of the overall number of legal immigrants admitted to the United States every year. And suppose in 1990, I guess it would have been 6 when my father first came here, if that number had been lowered and he had not made the threshold, is that somehow an indictment against my family or
right now the only way to get into this country from India in particular is like by marrying somebody. The wait is so long. And I don't understand how the commitment to technological primacy in the 21st century, which is one of the goals of your organization, with like closing the door on India, like, sorry to stereotype, but like those seem in conflict with each other.
Yeah, I think all of public policy is a balancing act, right? There is no set of public policies that have all good and no bad. There are trade-offs in everything. I mean, we get this criticism when it comes to the question of geostrategic competition with China as well. People say, well, you want to engage in competition with China. Why don't you basically create an open immigration regime with Hong Kong? It's like, no, there are balanced goods that have to be measured in public policy. And when it comes to what I think the squeaky wheels are in the American economy, in American society more broadly, immigration to solve a problem of deep technological malaise in the United States is a Band-Aid. It does not solve the root problem, and it carries externalities that are very damaging to our culture, to the ability for more low-wage immigrants and high-wage immigrants alike, more low-wage Americans and high-wage Americans alike to actually move up the ladder of opportunity. The real solution to technological advancement would be taking a good hard look at what the institutions that are responsible for crafting and shaping the brightest people in America are actually sending them to do. And as of right now, you get sent to do one of 2 things. Either make an extra quadrillionth of a cent on a micro stock transaction on Wall Street, or to monetize the attention of 7-year-olds at a tech company in Silicon Valley. That is not the way to be taking the highest IQ Americans and putting their talents to work. I'd much rather have a system that directed them towards the hard sciences, towards engineering, towards biology, towards chemistry, and we don't have that right now.
One of the things that I have never, and I don't like bringing like studies to the table and throwing stats, because everybody has their statistics and everybody has think tanks of which they always go to get counter numbers. My understanding of immigration, and particularly like technology jobs, is like you grow the pie when you bring in people who have specific skills and aptitudes to start businesses. You grow the amount of opportunity. And the way that you look at immigration, I feel like could be read as you cannot have a single immigrant in this country until every person who lives on the streets and in destitution is working and has their needs taken care of. Like, for the good of all Americans. That's very specific, and like, it seems like a great ideal, but like literally if you view it as a zero-sum game between immigrants and every American citizen, I feel like we are limiting the amount of what is possible. Like, you came here, right? And then you started an organization. Jobs. It's a silly example, but you get my point. Like, there's the idea that either the pie grows or the idea that it's static and shrunk by immigrants.
Yeah, I think that there's probably an intersection point at which there's diminishing returns on what you can do for the native population. And so then the question becomes, on net, what does a particular immigrant or a particular immigration program bring to the table in the United States? At which point there's not only economic concerns, but there's also cultural concerns. There's, societal concerns more broadly. The way that we frame immigration at American Moment is that immigration must be restricted in order to promote national solidarity and the economic well-being of all Americans. Former matters as well. What you have happening in border counties and even kind of moving ever more northward in states like Texas, in states like Arizona, it's not good. But there's a specific portion of it that I want to zero in on, which is that the children of immigrants in these communities that have extraordinarily high populations of foreign-born immigrants have an extraordinarily hard time being taught in English language. And if you don't share a language with your fellow citizens, you don't really share a polity. If you can't communicate with them, you don't really have a country. You have sort of different countries within one nation. That's a recipe for social dysfunction. It's a recipe for a very dangerous sort of politics. And a responsible immigration regime recognizes that any complex system can only take so much rapid change at once. And so we have to be measured, we have to be responsible, and we have to be a little bit, I would say, kind of bloodless in thinking about it. Again, emotions run very high on the immigration issue in the United States. Emma Lazarus wrote a poem once, and therefore we must have open borders. When in reality, extremely technologically advanced countries like South Korea, like Japan, have never had immigration regimes even remotely resembling what we're doing now. And neither does China. We can have technological advancement, we can have social cohesion without a dramatically massive amount of immigration. And also, there's another side to this, which is that our immigration regime has deep consequences for the countries from which immigrants come. My co-founder, Nick Solheim, he was a missionary in Honduras as a kid, and there were entire communities where the entire population was old people, mothers, and children. What's missing there? Fathers, because all the fathers had gone up to the United States in order to take advantage of what they saw as economic opportunity. And there was a serious social dysfunction that was going on in these communities because it's a pretty, normal conservative talking point to say that you need mothers and fathers in a community for it to be healthy.
The family is alone with the gangsters. That's right. All that's left.
That's right. And so, I think that sometimes people can be a little bit dishonest about how much this actually animates their thinking, but I think a truly humanitarian approach to immigration recognizes that, especially in the haphazard system we have right now, we often tear families apart through the incentives we create with our immigration system, and we remove reformers, builders, and sort of the engines of societal growth from countries that need them most.
The national solidarity part is maybe where I go in a different direction from you, because I agree with you, and I reject open borders ideology. I think it's ludicrous and would tear this country apart by and large. The area where I don't agree is the solidarity part, that our culture, families, social fabric, neighborhoods aren't made better by people from foreign countries. People talk about, Hispanic culture a lot, Latino families, and whether or not they are Christian versus non-believers, and whether or not they have children and come here to work, live and play happily. I mean, honestly, I view myself as having more in common with my Venezuelan neighbors who I have to talk to via Google Translate if I ever want anything than I do some San Francisco single mom. Like, those kind of values are incredibly different. And if those people are procreating in Brooklyn and San Francisco, I'm just like, maybe that's not the best idea. We should bring in some people who actually support the American ideal. Why don't you agree with that? Like, why don't you view people coming in from out of the country as maybe being more cohesive for American values than people who are born here?
Because unfortunately, you don't just bring an immigrant over when you allow someone to come to the country. You bring an entire lineage of people over, right? And so, for the same reasons that you feel like you are not, that aligned with the San Franciscoite or the Brooklynite, is the same reason that their children and grandchildren won't feel that much like you either. Our school system, our educational system, and our society more broadly right now is incapable of actually creating patriots right now. It seeks to teach people to hate their country. And so, it may be the case that the first generation immigrant from Venezuela or from India has social conservative priors. But as someone who has been deeply enmeshed in sort of second generation immigrant culture my entire life, their kids won't.
It wears off.
Yeah, it wears off. And if anything, it's more susceptible as well, because living in a society that teaches anyone who's not white that they are a victim and that they are surrounded by white supremacy that seeks to eliminate them from all sides gives them a chip on their shoulder, and they learn to hate their fellow countrymen, and especially if we haven't assimilated them properly to sharing, to feeling a part of the broader economy, which is something we tend not to do on the lower end of the immigration scale, or even on the higher end. If there's language barriers, if there's communal barriers, they've only ever grown up around other immigrants. We're creating citizens in full who have fully activated political rights, who hate the country and are taught by our education system and our broader culture that they should hate the country. And so you're going to have way more of those same people that you don't feel like you share values with in liberal cities, because again, in much the same way that the corporations that underwrite our porous immigration regime say, there's a joke that
Google, right?
Right. Well, I mean, in all cases, they support immigration because they want a pair of hands, and it's like, oh, there's this worker that comes with it. In much the same way, whereas you may see a worker or a person in a frozen moment of time, really you have to think about their kids, their grandkids, their great grandkids, and how they will relate to the American nation and whether or not they'll feel a part of it. And that's something that I think we're much worse at as a country than we once were. I think America was much more capable of assimilating people 50 years ago than it is today. And before we fix that, I think it's irresponsible to have such a porous immigration
What broke in
machine.
the assimilation machine?
I think it's what broke more broadly in American society, the complete dissolution of any sense of national self-confidence, any sense of identity, any sense of America being good, Americans being good. We essentially ceded all of our cultural institutions and educational institutions to civilizational arsonists who think that Howard Zinn's history of the United States is the history of the United States, that is definitive, that is historical. Anything else is propaganda. If that's the recipe, then it's very hard to unwind that without major reform.
That's a homegrown canon, and it's not going to go anywhere. I mean, there is no government bureaucratic solution, perhaps outside of the Department of Education, to deal with these things, other than bringing people from the outside who believe in the canon and actually want to teach their children about it. It seems like the hard-headed approach to the problem, sort of like what did Trump say about immigration? He was like, we got to shut all this down until we figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's right.
And I feel like that's basically what this is we do not have a grasp on the culture. We don't have a grasp on the country. We just need to shut it all down until we figure it out and tear each other's heads off.
Well, I mean, again, I think that the economics of the situation and the culture of the situation are deeply tied together. I think that if you were to restrict immigration, I believe in market mechanisms. You would increase the demand for the marginal worker's labor in the United States. They would have more purchasing power as a worker. They would be able to have an easier time getting married and raising a family. Raising families and getting married tends to make people more conservative. conservative, those people will then go on to be community leaders, to reform their education system from the inside, and to rebuild an America that is capable of assimilating newcomers. I think it's all cyclical. Pauses in immigration are wholly, represented in American history. We've done it many times before to great effect. It's been very good. One could even argue that the sort of Camelot of the post-war era was in part a byproduct of a previous immigration pause that allowed for this entire generation of mostly Eastern and Southern European immigrants to properly integrate into the country, and then to be part of the greatest war machine that the world had ever seen.
As far as where American Moment sort of fits into the nexus of new groups on the right with a different kind of goal, one thing I thought was interesting about your website, AmericanMoment.org, right?
That's correct.
You can go check it out. So I scanned through the whole thing, was kind of trying to get a sense of it. One thing I never saw throughout was the typical right-of-center mention of the founders or the Constitution, returning to anything, nothing about standing athwart history, shouting stop, only go. Mm-hmm. Is that purposeful? Because when I spend time with traditional conservatives, the trads here in DC, and once they're about 3-4 drinks in, they always tend to over-imbibe those traditional conservatives. They start shouting about monarchy. And it's what they do. And they try to pass it off as a joke. The trads always talk about monarchy as if they're joking. But they're not joking. Mm-hmm. I think they're telling the truth. They view the constitutional order of the United States as a mistake. And I got the impression, looking at your website and looking at American Moment, that is enmeshed in there somewhere as well. No. Only going forward, nothing to preserve.
No, not at all. I think the reason you probably didn't see any mention of the founding as such is because I think that is an anachronistic term that doesn't really mean anything. Mm-hmm. I have a hard time believing that one can create a conception of something called the capital T, capital F founding when, 5 years after it, the U.S. Congress, where a lot of the founders were, passed the Alien and Sedition Act. I'm interested in founders. Individual founders that we see as deeply consonant with our values. When we are building our set for Moment of Truth, you will always see busts of Washington and Hamilton, who are some of my favorites of the founders. There's a fantastic piece, I believe it's called American Nationalists, that was written by Yoram Hazony and Ophir Hively at the American Conservative last year, that talks about Washington and Hamilton and the American system of economics, the long tradition of this sort of industrialist, sort of developmental state posture that I share on economics, and its roots all the way back to the founding. When it comes to issues of foreign policy realism and restraint, looking to John Quincy Adams and George Washington's second inaugural, we see roots for every part of what we believe in the history and the tradition of the United States, and we do not want to abandon that at all. Look, I think more plebiscitary democracy is not an end to be pursued in and of itself. I think that, again, wholly within the American system was the idea that senators were appointed, not elected. How much democracy in terms of a prudential question we have in the United States is a separate question than whether or not we should continue the Republican form of government, which I believe that we should.
Because you don't want to do away with elites. You want new elites. Mm. Could you tell me a little bit about your view of that and how you actually get a better elite and how American Moment is going to produce those people? Because this town works on people in a bad way.
Yeah, in fact, that goes to a theory of mine, which is that I think ideas only get people so far. Ideas are powerful to the extent that they are held by people. And you need to pay very close. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if a think tank writes a white paper and there's no one to read it, did it really write anything? And realistically, how decisions are made, if you're in the Situation Room at the White House and there's an immediate decision to be made on should we get into a land war with Iran because they, knocked down one of our drones, the question isn't, well, what did so-and-so think tank write about our geostrategic position with Iran? Let me go consult Wikipedia. It's what are the instincts of the people in the room? What are their priors? What are their first principles? What are the first things they're looking to protect in civilization? My theory on elites is as follows. Every civilization since the beginning of time has had elites. Hierarchy is endemic to the human condition. And so if we want a functioning civilization, a thriving civilization, we have to pay very close attention to who those people are. It doesn't mean that I am an elitist. I just believe that elites exist. And I think that the current crop that we have in the United States in every domain of American life are terrible. They have no conception of the common good. They have no classical conception of the good. They aren't really that competent. It's all really kayfabe and not really well constructed and is purely papered over by power and by institutions that cover for them at their earliest mistake. Like a great example that I just love to think about is, I don't know if you saw recently, Pete Buttigieg got out of his Suburban 2 blocks away from the Department of Transportation to ride an electric bike to work. Yes. And the only reason we knew about it was because, some Twitter user with an iPhone caught a picture of it. But the New York Times would have never reported on that. That's sort of kayfabe, the fakeness and the silliness of our elite class is only concealed in part because all of our elite institutions conspired to conceal it as much as humanly possible.
How's American Moment going to filter out the bad from the good and pursue some kind of virtue for the people who are entering the bureaucracy and going into the gears of government? I mean, because in my experience, DC and organizations which place people in jobs, it's like flame and here come the moths. And I don't view virtue as being something that is going to be built here. It's going to be built out there in the real world. And then hopefully you are acting as a filter to then find them the right place. If our country is unvirtuous and our country is going down the pipes, I don't see how your organization fixes that by just doing job placement.
Yeah, look, I mean, we are not the be-all, end-all of anything. And I even sometimes get in trouble with using the term, creating new elites because it's kind of grandiose sounding, but it comes down to what my definition of what is inclusive. Well, it comes down to what my conception of what is inclusive of elites. And I think even a staff assistant, which to those not in the know is an entry-level position on Capitol Hill, pays less than $35,000 a year in some places, not glamorous work. You usually, mail letters, give people tours on the Capitol. That's about it.
They'll tell you they're not part of the elite.
Well, but it's my contention that they are. Because at that moment in time they are, because they're more likely to spend time around a congressman and the people who lead our government than 99.99% of Americans. So that alone. But then also the career trajectory that they're on can put them in enormous power. Absolutely. I mean, you had people in the Trump administration who were barely in their late 20s that were deputy assistant secretaries that had serious influence in the federal bureaucracy and were moving power forward. And so we are vigilant on specifically the entry valve for personnel in DC, because we recognize that you never know who's going to become the next Stephen Miller who's advising the president every single day, or the next Kellyanne Conway, or the next, so-and-so. And so, we take a systemic approach, which is that we're going to try to bring as many good people who share our values, who are tactically aligned, who are careful, who understand and have a mind for the sort of work that we have in mind, and who are of good character to Washington, D.C. And that is a very narrow slice of the pie of elites in America more broadly. It's a humble mission. Again, if I bring 500 people to bear the next time a conservative is elected to the White House and say these are 500 trustworthy, aligned people who have a vision for what the future needs to look like, I would have done my job. Again, it's a fairly narrow mission. I'm under no illusion that we can remake all of the American elite, but there needs to be parallel, nimble, small projects like this in every domain of American life in order to make a meaningful ground shift. And some of it's going to come from leadership from the top. It's going to come from people like President Trump or whoever the next figure like him is, people who singularly command the national imagination and are capable of moving in Overton windows so rapidly that the need for a new elite is created.
I want to back up to the existential problems that we face as a society. You are, like me, I think someone who looked at the David French v. Sohrab Ahmari battle with a lot of interest and a lot of indignation. So this was a fight between two, let's just call them intellectuals, right? Yeah. About drag queen story hour and whether or not it was the duty of a locality to ban such a thing and make sure that drag queens are not reading books to children in local libraries. And I got a video to show you because it is something along the lines of horrific. Let's roll it.
We all need this confidence in life.
We all need this confidence in life. It really hurts. It really hurts to watch.
Yeah.
What are you going to do about this? And what do any of us do about something like that? What is the good?
I think first of all, recognizing that that is not a blessing of liberty is the first step, and recognizing that at a certain point, it is the responsibility of government to foster public virtue. This is something that was never alien to conservatives. Even
can I ask you a quick question
please.
Before you continue? How do you define virtue? Because the Stoics, they all fought for generations over what virtue even is. How do you define it?
Look, I'm not a philosopher, but I think that there is a classical tradition that we can tap into. Human beings have been thinking about virtue, about common good for millennia. And it is a particularly modern sort of heresy that we've abandoned all of that. Just to said, those people didn't know what they were talking about. It's a complete abandonment of the classical tradition, classical conceptions of the good, usually like overlaid with some combination of like maximal liberalism being an end in and of itself, i.e. choice, and then also, some level of scientism, the idea, well, the science, capital S, capital CIE, and NCE, maybe I spelled that right, is what's saying something. And that all ties together to create all of the sort of, pathologies of our modern time. The idea that something like that is okay is something that would have been totally alien to everyone from like 50 years ago to 2,000 years ago.
So is the government response to that kind of thing a reactionary response, like, this is illegal, you can't do this to a child, or have them out in Times Square doing this? Who are the parents? We're going to take this child away. Or is it the thing that comes before it?
It's both. I mean, look, you have to clip weeds, and like whatever that is, stop it right now. But also it requires being vigilant and being more than just reactive in the long term. A great parallel issue that I like to talk about when it comes to something like this is big tech. Obviously, like, big tech is a problem now. The president of the United States was removed from the biggest social media platforms. His voice was heavily damaged. But it's funny, now that a lot of Republicans and conservatives are talking about big tech, I'm actually less interested in it as an issue, because now I'm thinking, what's the next thing that Americans or ordinary patriots are going to do?
Section 230 is very 1 year ago.
Yeah. Section 230 is very 4 years ago, actually.
Excuse me, 4 years.
But now we have to be vigilant. Like Bank of America, unprompted, was giving the information of people who flew to and from Washington, D.C. in and around January 6th to the federal government. Like, is what's coming next the inability for someone who disobeys a particular woke piety from being able to purchase a home or open a bank account or transact in fiat currency? We have to be vigilant about what comes next. And that means being more than just, playing whack-a-mole with particular bad things that we see in society. It's recognizing that proactively shaping a virtuous, a good, a well-functioning society requires the participation of conservatives in public policy, which, if there's one way to sum up what the conservative consensus over the last 25 years has been, it's that conservatives don't believe in public policy. Well,
and conservatives, to the child twerking in Times Square, have largely embraced the idea of liberty is do no harm, right? That what goes on in Times Square and in New York is not the problem of people living in Georgia, vice versa, and we want everybody to go hands off. It's the David Frenchism thing, which is, if you want Georgia to be Georgia, you need to let New York be New York. But New York never rests, and New York never stops at trying to spread its diseases out to the rest of the country. And so I take your critique that those things will always continue to propagate themselves. I just worry about the bureaucrats, the faceless kind of yes men people that you might want to put into government to implement those things. They're only there for so many years, and then the next people get the same ride they got, the same tools that you give them. The power structure is changing every 4 years in this country, and it makes me nervous. It
is, but I think the contrapositive is an important question. is the left is the left disarming as well, or are we unilaterally disarming? You have Bishop Garrison at the Department of Defense right now, essentially acting as a political commissar, rooting out quote unquote white supremacy, which basically translates to did you vote for Donald Trump in the military or wherever he can find. My approach to politics and tactics may have been different if it was at all an evidence to me that the left is willing to participate in a cooling down of political acceleration. But they're not. They're very interested in power. They're very interested in ensuring long-term propagation of their political interests, and they're willing to use government to do it. And a norm is only inviolate so long as it's not the immediate barrier in front of them in progress. This is my critique of anyone who dreams of the halcyon days of like the original ACLU and when the left was for campus free speech. The modus operandi of the left is that, we advocate for freedom when it suits our interests because that is their principle, talking to more rights-oriented people. And then we take away their freedom when we have power because it is our principle. That is the path. They'll start with what they see as the governmental barriers to capital P progress. And then after that, they'll actively use government power to ensure capital P progress. And that is the trajectory. And sometimes it's not within one generation. Sometimes it's even different figures. And so how do you go from an MLK to someone like a Bishop Garrison? It happens in successive generations because the gains made before were never enough. And that's how you get, the ideologies that rule America today.
We're going to table it here, and I want to ask you about something else entirely. So at the end of every show, we like to step back a little bit from the weighty issues and just talk about some good news and give everyone an opportunity to cleanse the palate. Saurabh, anything happy on your mind or in the news that you're looking at this week?
We're obviously thriving at American Moment, so that's always
thriving.
That's always
having happy hours.
That's right. It's always a white pill, as the kids say. And I'm really enthused because I think that in this moment especially, there's lots of young people, positive young people, that are interested in sort of constructively, putting their hat in the ring to be part of the solutions that we're advocating. And so it's just, I spend every day, I open my inbox and there's still, dozens of people who we have yet to talk to that want to get involved in this work. And that's just, it's extremely gratifying. I guess, maybe a less, work-related one would be, I think in parallel, we talked about Gen Z earlier.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of members of Gen Z look at the life that millennials and even some Gen Xers led of sort of the careerism at all costs, at 40, maybe take a peek over at getting married after you have 5 cats and an SSRI addiction, living in a pod in New York. And they're like, that's not a life to lead. I'd like my own thing.
There's an aspect of Zoomerism I really appreciate. Things made by hand, craft culture, handmade watches.
Yeah.
And this is maybe a little bit too far, but we went to Target the other week. My wife wanted to get something to wear for a dinner that we were going out to. We could not find a single thing that was pretty and summery in Target that did not look like it came from Little House on the Prairie. I knew that prairie culture was like catching on with Zoomers, but it was everything in the darn store.
Yeah.
It's like,
and then even beyond consumer preferences, right? I think that it's not a majority, but there is a significant sect of young people that are like, I'm going to get married young. Yeah. I'm going to have kids. My co-founder, Nick, just got engaged, it's the sort of thing I'm seeing everywhere. All at once, it seems like this is the year of my life that all of my peers decided they were going to start getting married. I went to the first wedding of a peer last year, and now he has a kid, and now I have 4 this year. And so, that's really exciting too, because
that's when life gets good.
Yeah. That shows you that civilizational renewal is possible, right? Because that is, strong families come first for a reason, and having families is a good first step to strong families. And so that's always exciting to watch, and I see it everywhere, not just in kind of DC young conservative land, but also just completely apolitical people. They're making an active choice that, especially, I think this may be one silver lining of COVID. I knew a lot of people who got shotgun married because they were like, why do we need to spend $25,000 on a wedding when we can put that as a down payment on a house?
Yep.
That's exciting.
I love it. I'll share mine. I slept for the first night in nearly a year for about 12 hours on Saturday this past weekend. Uninterrupted, hard sleep because I finished my book.
Congratulations.
I've been, so I've got a book coming out in October of this year. It is called How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. Your boy loves Star Wars.
That's cool.
So I started this book. I started the outline over a year ago, and I've been writing the book hard for about 6 months. And when you are writing a book, you just can't sleep.
What was the approach? So I think once Matt Iglesias had a great piece of recommendation, which is that like every day, like write only so many words and then like stop literally on the word that you can write up to. That way you'll always have like a sentence to finish when you start up the next day.
I've never heard that. Yeah.
So like what was your strategy to actually manage it? Because I'm a procrastinator.
Yeah.
I have a hard time. Like this is the one thing that terrifies me about ever writing a book is like I would treat it like a college school report and I'd like do it the night before, which you can't do with 800 pages.
So I really like that Iglesias advice, and I wish I had heard that. I would say that just like you don't get like book deals until you've got like an outline of the book. So you have to chart every chapter, what's going to be in every chapter, and then you kind of have a nice guideline. So those are like high school essay rules. You do the framework.
The
first.
hamburger.
Yeah, but you have to set time to actually write the book. If you think you're going to be able to fit it into your normal life, you are wrong. So I started my days at 4 a.m.
Wow.
For the past 6 months, every day at 4 a.m., get up before my daughter, get up before my wife, and watch the sun come up with my book. And that comes at a cost, which is when you go to sleep at night, you know you have to get up at 4 and you can't turn your mind off and you just don't sleep well. But you get that dedicated time every single day. The problem I found in doing that was that when you have morning writing time, when you come back to it the next day, you got to read what you wrote because you're like half asleep.
Yeah, you've had 20 hours of activity since you can't remember.
Yeah, you come back to it and you're like, ooh, that's a mess, or none of that even makes sense. So it can really prolong the writing process, which is why you got to take a vacation and write on the vacation.
That's right. Well, congratulations.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you for watching this week of Right Now with Stephen Kent. I am Stephen Kent, and we will be back next week on Thursday. We'll see you then.